done here is I've used an edit poly modifier to actually attach these spheres to this geometry here, and it's actually still procedural. You know, if we animate through time, you can see that it's wobbling around. But if we do a wireframe, you'll actually see that these objects are actually all joined together. They're one mesh, and that's done procedurally by using the edit poly modifier. And I've used the attach option here to attach these spheres in here. When it does so, it actually creates an element for each one of these. So I can go in and I can select each element individually. It's basically Max's way of remembering when meshes were actually separate objects before they were attached together. It remembers each one of them as an element. And if I deselect that and come back out again, and what I've done then is I've used material by element, which allows us to set up different material IDs. And here you've had to actually set up a proportion value here, which actually defines what's the chance randomly for a certain ID to appear on any one of our elements. Down the bottom, as you can see, because it's random, there's a seed, and you can change that seed value, and that gives us different results as it randomly cycles through our different material IDs there. Let's move on now to have a look at the conversion modifiers. The conversion group is a pretty specialist set of modifiers which are nonetheless important within the procedural workflow of 3ds Max. In certain stacks you may have the need to convert an object from one geometry type to another. For an example, you may want to change from an editable poly into a patch for whatever reason. Indeed, if needed, you can also convert an object from one type to another using the corresponding edit modifier. Say, if you use edit patch, that will turn whatever the object is into a patch at that point. But the edit modifiers are much more Swiss Army knife-like in their nature. And often using them is simply overkill, because they actually require a lot more memory and a lot more system resources. So if you want to very simply change an object from one type into another, then you should use the conversion modifiers. Now in this case you can see I've got our parametric cylinder here, then I've got a point cache on it, and then I've got a turn to poly modifier. Now that's all it's done. It's very simply turned into an editable poly object at that point, and there's no really visible difference in the mesh, because when it changes from a parametric object into a poly object, you don't really notice any difference, to be honest. So as I said, if you want to parametrically change an object into another base geometry type, as we covered earlier, then you can use the conversion tools. Okay, let's finish off by having a look at the standard modifier. Now, the only standard modifier is the attribute holder modifier, and perversely this modifier actually does nothing, so it's often referred to as a null modifier. Null as in it does nothing, it doesn't actually modify at all. Now its purpose is to merely act as a blank canvas onto which custom attributes can be added by the user. We looked at earlier in the DVD how each node has a number of parameter entries, and these can also be thought of as attributes. In this case, Max calls them attributes. And let's say you wanted to have some attributes for your own custom rigs, and this is where the custom attributes come in. And it's often used as part of a custom rig, as I said, to put controls on. So although it actually performs no modification itself, the custom attributes assigned to it are often pivotal in procedural rigs to one extent or another. So let's have a look at it here in these two, in this very basic setup. I've actually applied an attribute holder modifier to the top of this stack here, and it's actually got two custom attributes applied to it, which I've actually done myself. One is called top expand and one is called mid bulge. And what they're doing is they're wired into a copy that I've made of the morph modifier that we saw earlier. So if we look here in the stack, you can see we've got that morph modifier again, and in this case I've renamed these two targets to give you a better idea of what each one does. Then we've got a mesh smooth on top of that, and in this case you can see it's smoothing the sides of the cylinder but nothing else, so I'll just do that again. There you are, so you can see the mesh smooth is coming in there. And then I've got this attribute holder at the top, and it's got these two custom attributes and it's got a slider, and I've actually wired up those attributes to the two channels which you have here, these two parameters here. You've got this percentage here and this percentage here. And I've used the wiring system in Max rather than instancing the controller. I've actually wired it, which, as I said earlier in this DVD, is something we'll be covering in a lot more detail in future DVDs in our series. And what it allows us to do now is actually click on the object. We've got a user interface here, and I can actually just change that value just by moving that slider, as you can see. Because it's a modifier, we can obviously instance it onto another object. So what I've done is I've actually created a spline object here. I've made it renderable so you can actually see it's got a slight thickness to it. And then I've actually instanced that attribute holder modifier onto it. And as you can see, I can actually get the same parameters and change them here and here. So yeah, as you can see, we can change them in exactly the same way. And the really cool thing is, if we actually look at the original object, we've got the same parameters here. So we can actually access the same controls from two different objects in our scene. So as you can see, the custom attributes are really, really cool, and by using wiring or instancing, you can wire them up to other parameters and have them form the backbone for a user interface for animation. Okay, so now we have a pretty good grasp of what proceduralism is, and we also know how the stack and modifiers access this workflow within 3ds Max. Let's have a closer look at the topic of topological dependency, which was something that we actually touched on in this chapter. It's very important as it plays a major part in any kind of rigging setup. So let's do that now.